Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of our Chapter 4 lecture series, where we will be discussing slave cultures and slave resistance. The focus question for this section is, what factors led to distinct African American cultures in the 18th century? One thing we have to understand about the evolving culture of African Americans in English society in the 18th century was that slavery in North America threw together individuals of African origin, but with different languages, different cultures, different religions, of various ethnicities and tribal affiliations. It was very difficult at first for these African slaves to see all other African slaves in the same light due to the cultural and ethnic and tribal differences between them and among them. There was no overarching sense of African identity, or certainly not a sense that their shared black skin coloration made them somehow all the same or in the same boat. African American culture, as it emerged from this mixing and mashing of various different African cultures, was a synthesis of those various African traditions, as well as a healthy dose of European elements and new conditions in which the African slaves found themselves in the Americas, all to form and create this very distinct and unique African American culture in North American society. Now, even with all of the previous being said, African American cultures, as they emerged in the English colonies, were not the same across the various regions. The different slave systems that were the feature of these various regions produced different African American cultures out of them. In the Chesapeake region, there was really a more family-centered slave communities. Now, although marriage between slaves was technically illegal, not recognized by law, common law marriages more or less did occur, and family units were able to form in Chesapeake society, despite the constant threat of separation due to sale or other things of that nature that those family units faced. They had a high rate of natural reproduction, and they had also a high rate of exposure to English culture and society, as well as religious conversion to Christianity. So the enslaved were consistently exposed and acculturated to English culture in those Chesapeake regions. Now, in South Carolina and Georgia, it was a bit different. There was much less oversight of the African slave communities on the rice plantations in those regions, as there was on the tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake region. Remember, they had that task system, which basically allotted each slave a specific amount of work for each day. Whenever they completed that, they were free to spend the rest of their time pretty much as they so chose. Whereas in the Chesapeake region, the gang system, required severe and constant oversight and interaction between the slaves and their owners or overseers. So in South Carolina and Georgia, the culture remained much more African-centered and focused. There was a lower birth rate, which also meant that there was more consistent imports of newly arrived Africans, which kept the African elements in those cultures more active and alive, and there was less opportunity for English culture to seep in and dilute the Africanness of the culture in those regions. These are also the regions that are known for the Gullah dialect, which is a pidgin language that combined elements of both African languages and English to create a hodgepodge language that is actually still spoken in small communities on the coast of South Carolina today. Now, in the northern colonies, the small numbers of slaves and the fact that many of them were dispersed amongst the colonial population. There wasn't a large collection of slaves that were put together on plantations like there was the Chesapeake and down further south. So there was less opportunity for a distinct African American culture to form in the North. And the enslaved peoples there generally acculturated more to English culture and lifestyles than they did in even the Chesapeake, but certainly further south in South Carolina and Georgia. Slave peoples in the Americas certainly did not passively take their situation lying down. Resistance to slavery appeared in various forms throughout the course of the institution's existence. Fundamentally, the desire for freedom is inherent in the human condition. One of the ways, of course, the enslaved would display their defiance would be in running away, which often occurred amongst the slave populations. In fact, many times they would collectively come together in groups of runaways and form maroon communities in very rural and inhospitable parts of the countryside. There was in fact a large maroon community in the Great Dismal Swamp that straddles the border between North Carolina and South Carolina, a little bit to the north of us. Of course, small daily acts of defiance occurred over and over again. Things like breaking tools, faking sick, anything the enslaved could do to undermine the planter's authority and scoop out a little slice of personal freedom for themselves. Of course, slave uprisings did occasionally occur, not frequently, but enough to keep the fear of such things alive in the minds of the white population of the English colonies in North America. A couple of significant slave uprisings was one in New York City in 1712. Another significant one occurred in Louisiana in 1731. But perhaps the most significant slave uprising of the early 18th century was the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina that occurred between 1739 and 1741. This was a very interesting case because it was led by recently imported Congolese African slaves who had already been converted to Catholicism in their homeland in Africa. So the proximity of South Carolina to the Spanish in Florida, who were of course Catholics, compelled some of these Congolese Catholic slaves to try to run away, escape, and seek safe haven in Florida amongst the Spanish Catholics. They staged an uprising in South Carolina and attempted to march down to Florida where they hoped to gain their freedom, and along the way attacked several different plantations and communities and killed quite a few of the local white population. Of course, the South Carolina militia was put together and was able to put this rebellion down. But like Bacon's rebellion previously in the Chesapeake region, the result of this Stono rebellion was a hardening, a tightening of the slave codes in South Carolina that had a similar effect on the ideas of race and racism and free and slave as the aftermath of Bacon's rebellion did in those Chesapeake regions. Fundamentally, desires for freedom knew no racial boundaries, and African American slaves sought out freedom in any way they could, given their circumstances, under the conditions in which they found themselves. That concludes part 2 of our Chapter 4 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.